The forest is one of the oldest and most prominent fears in all of human history. From our ancient fairy tales to our modern blockbuster horror films, the forest is a place to be feared and avoided. The famous comedian Norm Macdonald once said, "Nothing good ever happens in the woods." And I'm here to talk about that. Even as little kids, we're taught that the forest is a scary place, a place to be avoided, at least without adult supervision. A lot of these old fairy tales actually really started for like stories that moms would tell their kids or parents would tell their kids to keep them out of the woods at night or without them around so that they wouldn't get harmed by the very real things that are in the woods that can hurt you, like wolves, bears, etc. A classic example that everyone knows is Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is an old fairy tale from medieval times about a girl named Little Red Riding Hood who is going to take her sick grandmother wine and cheese, and she's going through the woods to get to her grandmother's house, and her parents warn her to stay away from the big bad wolf. And while going into the woods, she actually runs into the wolf and finds him pretty cordial. After her encounter with the wolf, unbeknownst to her, the wolf rushes ahead and meets her at her grandmother's house. Not before taking her grandmother and, in some tales, hiding her in a closet, or, in the original story, eating her. And after he eats her, he lays in her bed and wears her clothes and mimics her grandma as Little Red Riding Hood comes in. We all know the classic story of, what big teeth you have, what a big nose you have, and what a big mouth you have. And then the wolf says, "All the better to eat you with," and jumps up and promptly eats Little Red Riding Hood. Just at this moment, by some stroke of luck, a woodsman comes in with an axe and kills the wolf and cuts Little Red Riding Hood and her grandma out, and the day is saved. Happily ever after. While this story is told to us as children, the images that it can and very well should conjure up for you, the images of a dark woods and a conniving, mischievous, evil entity that lives in there known as the Big Bad Wolf. This entity makes his way into other fairy tales, not so forest related, like the Three Little Pigs. But another fairy tale that we all know that involves a more realistic historical time period is that of Hansel and Gretel.
Hansel?
And it's raining really hard now. So Hansel and Gretel is the story of two German children during a time in Germany that was a plague. There was a famine, and there was no food around, and people were starving to death. And this was a legitimate historical event that was happening. And this fairy tale is supposed to take place during that time. This was around the 1300s. Hansel and Gretel's stepmom tells their dad that they no longer can afford to feed all of the mouths, so why don't we just get rid of Hansel and Gretel and we can feed ourselves? So, overhearing this, because they're so hungry they can't sleep, Hansel and Gretel are scared and they don't know what to do. But Hansel has a plan. He goes outside and he collects stones, because he overheard the stepmother's plan to take them into the woods and leave them there. And so the next day, whenever the parents are like, "All right, let's go for a family trip through the woods," Hansel and Gretel know what's up, and they are not afraid, because Hansel has in his pocket all these shiny stones that he places on the ground behind him as they walk deeper and deeper into the big bad forest. Whenever their parents finally leave them and say, we're going to go collect wood for the fire, we're going to go forage for berries, whichever it is, they don't plan on coming back. And the father is apprehensive about this, but the evil stepmother, which is a reoccurring theme in fairy tales, has no remorse. And Hansel and Gretel have no trouble finding their way back. And when they make it back to the house, the parents pretend like they were so worried and so glad that they made it back and that they got lost or something like that. A few more months go by, and the stepmother again talks to her husband, Hansel and Gretel's father, and says, look, we have to get rid of these kids. We are starving to death. We can't afford to feed all of these people. And so once again they do it again. But this time Hansel and Gretel are a bit at a loss. They don't have any of the stones that they once did have. So they wander into the forest, and Hansel has these breadcrumbs that he has taken from a loaf of bread in their house, and he leaves them behind him. But this time, when the parents leave them in the woods alone, they have trouble finding the breadcrumbs because the birds of the forest have come and eaten them. And then Hansel and Gretel find themselves lost, with no way to get back home. So Hansel and Gretel have found themselves lost in the woods. The birds have eaten the crumbs that Hansel has left behind, and now they are stuck. You know, it's actually kind of easy to get lost in the woods. Reports are varying, but at least a few hundred people go missing in national parks, places where there is woods, every year. And it's estimated from like the 50s up to the 90s, there are still at least 1,000 people missing that were never found. And to me, that is the true horror of the woods itself. We're just sort of not suited for the elements in our modern society. There are things one can do when they find themselves lost. The humorist Patrick McManus gave some tips about panicking, and he talks about how in all these survival guides, the first thing they say is do not panic, as if there's some sort of checklist in which someone can just cross off panicking and decide not to do it. It's kind of a hard thing to suppress when you feel the woods just closing in around you and you don't know where you are or how to get back to where you should be. There are hundreds and hundreds of videos of people talking about missing 411 cases. This will not be another one. You can go watch one of those. I'd rather talk about something that happened to someone in my family, something a little more personal. In the 80s and 90s, my family deer hunted in northwestern Illinois, and on one of these trips, my uncle was out with his uncle, and they were scouting for some new places to put stands one year, and they got separated. And my uncle just kind of realized he had no idea where he was. He had never been to this particular location before. He gave out the call that was sort of predetermined by members of our familial hunting camp. It was a long whistle, and his whistle was not answered. So he began to panic, but he decided not to run yet. He remembered maybe some survival tip about moss growing on the north side of trees. If you'll look over there, there's a tree with moss growing on it, and it's growing on the west side of the tree. So what side of the tree moss grows on is not a good indicator of where you are, and it could only get you more lost. So my uncle finds himself extremely lost because he's seeing moss growing on all sides of the trees. And it's starting to get a little bit dark outside. It's not a bright sunny day like it is today, It was likely a cold, cloudy day in November, and he had no idea where he was. And so he just kept walking, and then walked some more and walked further. Night was closing in on him, and shadows were beginning to become more frightening. Dark corners of the woods housing some sort of terrible beast that would surely come and kill him. He made his way across the field until he found a road, and then he followed that road until he found a house where a nice older couple offered to give him a ride back to the hunting camp. Pretty chill story, but it's easy to tell stories about people getting lost or watch movies about people getting lost because you're not in that situation. Being lost is possibly one of the worst feelings you can get because it's one of the greatest dangers of being alone in the woods. Lots of horror movies that center around the woods often sort of flirt with this sort of being lost concept as a sort of ramping up to the action of finding the monster or witch or whatever is happening in the story. But no movie really does getting lost justice like the Blair Witch Project. Now, the title of the movie is a little deceiving because obviously you're going to go in thinking it's all going to be about the witch, and that's what the horror is going to be derived from. And while it sort of is in the background, the main source of fright and terror from the movie is just these hikers being lost. We see them getting confused and going in circles and beginning to get angry with one another, and their minds are sort of in panic mode for several days, as according to the story. And nothing quite captures that essence of being lost and how terrifying that is, quite like that movie. One thing you can do if you're lost, if night is coming in on you and you have no idea where you are and you're too tired to keep going, if you don't have the means to build a fire, then you don't necessarily have to unless it is particularly cold, in which case you should probably figure out how to build a fire. But if you don't need to build a fire, there are some simple shelters you can make to sort of protect yourself from various elements as long as they don't get too extreme. One of these shelters, the easiest one that requires the least amount of equipment to make and the least amount of skill, is a lean-to.
So lean-tos are fairly easy to build. You just want to take a large central log and place it against a tree, and then start adding smaller and smaller logs across the sides, and eventually you'll build up a sort of fortified structure. And once you have enough wall structure, you can start placing leaves and moss and various other things across that to create a sort of roofing, and it will block out quite a bit of weather.
Get yourself a piece of log that's pretty decently sized, likely less wet than this, but this will do. And get the bark off of it as best as you can. Once you get all the bark stripped off of it, you're gonna cake and cut about a section about yay long. Just like that. And you'll have yourself a section about like this, and then you're gonna wanna split it down the middle. So once you got her split in two like this, then you're gonna split these pieces into two. Once you get them split up into pieces, then you're gonna wanna take all of them and shave a pretty good section up out of this middle area all the way to what will be the top. So once you put Humpty Dumpty back together again, there will be a big hole. That's where you're going to put your fuel for the candle. But before you do that, you need to tie the pieces together so they don't fall apart. Now take some of that twine that you got off that old hiker's body, and you're going to wrap your candle to keep the pieces together. Just like that. I can do the same thing at the top and the bottom. Wrap it a few more times. Alright, so now it's not going to come apart in your hand, and you've got all of that. And now we're going to go get the fuel. You're going to want to find a grouping of pine trees. You see, pine trees have this great stuff called sap, and that's what you're going to be using to fuel your candle. And now we're back to where it all began, the campfire. The campfire is home to the beginnings of human civilization and storytelling. Stories that would eventually grow the societal fear of the woods around us. So curl up in your sleeping bags, get all nice and cozy, and get ready for some campfire stories. Some classics and some new ones. About 50 years ago in these very woods, there was a lumberman coming home from his job. And when he got home, he found that his wife was having an affair. Enraged by this, the jealous woodsman took his axe and chopped his wife's lover into tiny, tiny pieces. He turned the axe on his wife. When the police arrived later that day, the lumberman was nowhere to be found, and he had run off into these woods somewhere. So a search ensued, but they never found him. But some say if you're in these woods alone at night, you can still hear the lumberman screaming out, still enraged, a vengeful spirit. Don't get too close, or he just might cut you up next. There was a young man and a young woman who had lived in the mountains their whole lives, and they had decided at the age of 18 and 19 to get married. This was years ago, around the 1950s. They came into town and went to the Justice of the Peace, signed a marriage certificate, and they were hitched. The young lady had a really pretty dress on that she had spent entirely too much money on. The young man had spent his entire winter building this cabin for them to live in after the wedding. While they were in town, they thought they'd get some groceries and some things to make the house nice for their wedding night. The young woman was growing tired, and her new husband said, "Go on back, and I'll meet you at the cabin." So the young lady got on her horse and rode back up to their new home, up through the mountains. She knew her new husband wouldn't be there till much later that night, especially now that he would be walking and not taking the horse, which she was now riding up to their cabin. The husband lingered longer in town than he had anticipated, and it was nearly nighttime before he finally began to head back for home, laden with groceries. As he entered the forest, he began to feel this strange sense, this sort of overwhelming sadness that he couldn't quite understand. He tried to brush the feeling off, but it sort of just lingered. The moon was bright that night on his way back to the cabin, and he really didn't need any light to see his way back. As he walked, he came into a sort of clearing, and he could see the beams of moonlight streaming through the trees, sort of broken up by the leaves around it. And then the beams sort of focused into a shape. And he looked and he realized that the shape the moonbeams were making was that of his new bride. He could easily make out her white dress and her beautiful blonde hair. She was weeping, her head in her hands. The new husband knew then why he had felt that overwhelming sadness. And he felt it anew, deeper, more real, more tangibly so. For now he knew that his young bride had met her end on her way back to the cabin. The mountains were no stranger to bears or wolves. He figured as much had happened to his new bride. He felt immense guilt for letting her go back alone. He wanted to surprise her when he got back to the cabin with a bouquet of roses. But instead now, he walked to this vaporous apparition of his young bride and set the flowers at her feet. She never looked up at him. She never stopped crying. Overcome with grief, the young husband, now widower, made his way up to the cabin anyway and laid down and tried to go to sleep. He thought perhaps it was all a dream, a very terrible dream. He couldn't sleep though. His grief was too strong and too great. And as he laid there in bed, he could hear in the woods around him the painful sobs of his young bride. He stepped outside to try to find her. Perhaps what he had seen was only a premonition. He ran through the woods, but he was far too late. He came across her body, and it had in fact been attacked by wolves. He picked up his young bride's limp body in his hands and arms and cried and cried louder. His cries echoed throughout the woods, and he swore that they were answered by more painful ones. The cry of his wife's ghost. The grief was far too much for him. So, by the light of the moon, he carried his dead bride to the edge of a waterfall, and they jumped in together. Some say if you go to that waterfall, deep in that forest, or go visit that cabin, you can hear the young bride and young husband crying out for one another in the woods, lost and scared. It's best to avoid that area because their sadness proliferates the very air that you breathe there. And many, like the unfortunate young couple, have been driven to jump from the falls. Oh my God, could you not? That story scared me, and then that happened. Hey! Hansel and Gretel were alone in the woods and scared to death. They had no idea how to get back home, or even if they wanted to go back home to their evil stepmother and their father who seemed to just let them fend for themselves in the woods. But Hansel held a strong face for Gretel. He said, "It's okay, we'll get through this." They wandered through the woods. It had begun to get dark, and then they saw a house. They ran up to it and found the house to be quite strange. It was made of gingerbread. So they were starving, and they began to eat the house. and out came the owner of the house, an old lady, and she asked the two children if they'd like to come in and eat. There was plenty more food out in there, and they didn't have to eat her house. And while the two children ate, the witch began to stoke her oven. She asked Hansel to step outside, and while he was out there, she locked him in a cage. Hansel screamed to try to get Gretel's attention from inside the house, but the gingerbread walls of the house blocked any of Hansel's screams from getting in. The old witch came back inside, and Gretel kind of wondered why Hansel hadn't come back in with her. She said, "I sent him to gather berries." And Gretel thought this was strange, but let it be for then. She was starving and wanted more to eat, and the witch promised to show her how to cook a great meal. The witch couldn't help herself. She began to spit curses at Gretel and talk about how she was going to eat her and her brother. Gretel was scared for her life, but this old witch was still much bigger than she was. The witch asked Gretel to climb into the oven, and Gretel thought quick. And she said, "I can't. There's something at the back. I can't fit." The witch was perplexed. Like, what could be at the back? Charred remains of the last children I ate. So she sticks her head in the oven and can't find anything. She's like, "There's nothing in here." And Gretel knew what she was doing. She gave the witch a firm kick in the backside, and she fell into the oven herself. Gretel slammed the door behind her and lit the wood underneath. The oven heated up quick, and the witch didn't last long. Gretel ran outside and freed her brother, and they took off running through the woods. This harrowing experience had frightened them, certainly, but now they were still lost in the woods with no way home. Soon they came to an old stream and found on it a giant swan. They recognized the bank on the other side. They knew that that was close to their home. So the swan let them on its back and took them to the other side. By the time Hansel and Gretel had returned home, they found that their stepmother had died. She had starved to death. Their father was emaciated but alive, and more than thrilled to see his children. They embraced in their little cottage and began to cry together, not knowing what they would do. But when Hansel and Gretel told their father of what had happened to them in the witch's house, they knew what they could do. So the next day, Hansel and Gretel led their father back to the witch's house, and they dismantled it and brought back food for their entire village. As humans, we are hardwired to conquer. Go, therefore, and subdue the earth. This natural protocol in our brain to make things bend to our own will, I think, is one of the things that makes the forest so scary to us. Behind me is a good example of that. A failed attempt at some form of conquering the forest. An old tree stand, now dilapidated and falling apart, because the woods itself has taken it back, or has started to. It has crushed what we have put into it, and is bringing it down to the ground slowly. This is why I think the forest can be overwhelming for so many people. It's so hostile to everything that we're comfortable with. And the most comfort we can hope for is a sleeping bag and hopefully a dry ground. But I can't help but feel that those that are truly afraid of the forest that never enter into it because of the fear they have of it just misunderstand it completely. It's not for us to conquer. It's a sign of what is bigger than us, that is still all around us. There's an entire ecosystem that functions 100% efficiently without us in it. And actually can be messed up when we try to take and put our hands on everything inside of it. It may not be in frame, but there is a bridge right there. And that bridge is probably the second or third iteration of the same bridge in the same location, because nature has taken it and done what nature does to it. That bridge has been swallowed up and crushed by the forest at least 2 times. This whole area I'm standing in is actually a lowland, and there's a creek right there. Sometimes that creek floods, and when that creek floods enough, that bridge goes away and is returned, though in pieces, to the forest, offered up as a sacrifice to the wilderness. Framing the forest in this way is actually kind of terrifying. You can kind of understand why someone might be afraid of the forest, but as I said a minute ago, I don't think those who are truly afraid of it understand it. I've actually worked pretty hard to make this video scary. Turns out it's actually quite difficult to make the forest look terrifying. I've messed around with filters, I've used different camera settings, I've filmed at specific times of day, during storms, at night, things such as. But the woods itself, truly, in its natural state, is one of the greatest beauties of the world. And many of the most beautiful things a human being can see or do are in the forest. To acknowledge the beauty of the forest is not to undermine its terror. The sheer darkness of the woods at night is enough to make a man start seeing things. That's why it's important to carry light with you. Survival tip number 1, have a light. Here's the thing about light, especially in darkness. It can be seen for miles. If the light just stays where all the lights are, then one light doesn't do much. But one light in a sea of darkness can make all the difference and can be seen from miles and miles and miles away. So, I say to you, go into that cold, dark night and shine your light for all to see.
I've heard of a land of joy and peace and wonderful life, a beautiful place of mansions fair and skies so bright, where all who believe the Savior dear forever shall stay. And having been saved by grace divine, I'm going that way. I'm going that way. I'm going that way. Yes, dear, the Savior I adore is with me each day. I'm clinging to Him and never to stray, just singing praises all day long. I'm going that way. Well, glorious news I tell and sing as onward I go, for those who are still astray in sin, my Savior may know. I want them to sing that praise above some beautiful day. For glory to Him who died for me, I'm going that way. I know I shall meet Him at the gate when trials are past. I know I shall meet Him face to face in glory at last. Oh, I believe that when we meet, well done, He'll say, while trusting my soul indeed.